Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Lora Killian. Lora is the Director of Transparency and Disclosure at Synchrogenix, a Certara company. She's responsible for the development and oversight of Synchrogenix's entire suite of transparency services, which include anonymization, clinical trial disclosure, and plain language summary development. Lora has played an integral role consulting with sponsors in the development of company-specific transparency policies to address the latest wave of regulation arising out of the European Union and the United States. Lora, welcome to today's event. I'll now turn it over to her to begin the presentation.
Compliance webinar. In this environment in which both sponsors and the EMA are still figuring out how to implement this game-changing policy, compliance has definitely become more complicated. Today, we will be discussing some of the existing complications and solutions. First, we will discuss regulatory document publication, the requirements actually driving the preparation and delivery of documents to the public domain. Next, we will talk about supporting documentation required by the EMA for Policy 70, the justification table and the anonymization report, and the challenges in preparing those two documents. I will also talk about the process of operationalizing Policy 70. Then I will cover a broader approach to transparency and disclosure. And lastly, I will introduce our new lay summary portal that will be rolled out soon. As a quick review for those of you who are newer to transparency and disclosure, Policy 70 was published in October of 2014. It went into effect for marketing authorization applications submitted to EMA as of January 1st, 2015. Despite the fact that the policy went into effect for submissions made as of January 1st, 2015, we didn't actually receive the published guidance document that outlined how we were to go about implementing this new policy until March of 2016. In December of 2016, we received a new updated guidance. To date, EMA has published 8 submissions on its clinical data publication website. The first documents were published in October of last year. 2 reports have been published every month since October. Policy 70 is meant to be a 2-round process. In the first round, labeled by the EMA as the redacted proposal version, the deliverables include a cover letter with templated language provided in the guidance document, a document list of all the components submitted in the redacted proposal version, and the submission documents that include proposed anonymization changes and proposed company confidential information redaction. The justification table listing the company confidential information proposed for redaction, and lastly, the anonymization report outlining the method by which the submission documents were anonymized for privacy information. The final redacted version includes all of those documents required for the redacted proposal version with 2 modifications. The justification table is a document that's intended to be a communication vehicle between the sponsor and the EMA, and is not actually a part of the final redacted version, and it's not a document that's made public. And as would be expected, the proposed redactions in the submission document are converted to full redactions based upon what is finally agreed during the consultation process. Policy 70 is not the only regulation or requirement driving publication of regulatory documents. EU Policy 43 actually predates Policy 70, and it does not require that documents be placed in the public domain. Under Policy 43, the EU's Freedom of Information Act, any individual can request documents utilized in the EMA decision-making process. These documents are redacted for privacy information and potential company confidential information by the EMA as opposed to the sponsors, but they are provided back to the sponsors for feedback. Sponsors can request changes to what the EMA proposed to redact, but in our experience working with sponsors, the EMA has not really been willing to accept the majority of the additional redactions requested by sponsors. The clinical trial regulation, another EU regulation, was published in April of 2014 and is expected to go live in October of 2018. Under this regulation, redacted CSRs will need to be provided in conjunction with results postings for the EU clinical trial registry. And last, from a regulatory perspective, the U.S. final rule was published in September of 2016 and went live for trials registered or results posted as of January 18, 2017. Under this regulation, protocols and SAPs will be required to be posted with trial results on clinicaltrials.gov. These documents are not actually required to be redacted, and the NIH has stated that they don't intend to review or comment on the document systematically. However, they do reserve the right to provide feedback if they feel that sponsors have over or under redacted. Another effort placing regulatory documents in the public domain is the requirement for many medical journals to submit a redacted protocol and SAP with any submitted publication. The timelines for these submissions do not necessarily correspond with regulatory timelines. The ICMJE's transparency policy and the World Health Organization's guidance on when trials should be submitted for publication in medical journals will in many cases be prior to actual submission to the EMA, potentially leading to multiple anonymized versions of these same documents. Prior to Policy 70, the majority of transparency efforts being made by sponsors were as a result of Policy 43, sponsors' own transparency policies, and protocols and SAPs required to be submitted with publications. Documents shared under Policy 43 and data requests made to sponsors were provided directly to individuals or individual entities that were usually researchers, and in the case of Policy 43, could also be competitors. As previously mentioned in the case of Policy 43, the EMA redacts the documents and provides the sponsors an opportunity to suggest additional redactions or modifications. For requests made directly to sponsors or made for the sponsor's own transparency policies, the sponsor is actually able to choose what and how to anonymize the document. Additionally, the documents are typically being provided directly to those individuals or specific entities. And in the case of direct-to-sponsor requests, the sponsor has the opportunity to determine the terms of use. In this post-Policy 70 era, the practices are different. Rather than coming up with overall anonymization policies, sponsors are being asked to assess each and every submission on its own to determine unique anonymization techniques that will maximize data utility and protect patient privacy on a submission level. Sponsors can no longer choose how they want to anonymize their documents. The EMA is weighing in on how anonymization should be carried out, affecting all the publication efforts of these same documents. As mentioned, there are additional deliverable requirements, the justification table and the anonymization report, and one of the biggest factors is that these documents are being made public and not going to a specific individual or entity, as most documents were in the pre-Policy 70 era. And lastly, the EMA gets to dictate the terms of use for the individuals who choose to access these documents publicly. There were 3 significant changes that came out of the updated EMA guidance in December of last year. The first was a requirement for specific colors to be used for the redactions and the overlay text for those redactions. PPD redactions are now required to be in blue with black overlay stating PPD, and CCI redactions are required to be in black and red overlay stating CCI. This requirement actually came into play during the consultation process for several of our sponsors prior to the guidance being published. We were able to incorporate this change into our process prior to our sponsors needing to submit their final redacted versions, but our sponsors willingly shared with the EMA a concern in the way that they rolled out these changes. Our system utilizes technology, both an AI tool and a front-end redaction tool created specifically for pharma regulatory anonymization processes. Technology cannot necessarily be altered at the flip of a switch. We would like to see EMA, as I'm sure many of our sponsors would as well, incorporate phase-in timeframes to requirements going forward, or industry is going to find it difficult to incorporate technology into their processes, and it's ultimately up to technology to long-term make this process more efficient. The second major change to come out of the guidance was an increase in scope. Initially, the only clinical study reports required for anonymization and submission under Policy 70 were those included in the actual initial submission. However, EMA has now updated its definition of in scope to say that clinical study reports referenced in the submission, but not necessarily submitted as a part of the package, could be considered in scope. This change in definition has created significant challenges to preparation and timelines. It means that sponsors do not definitively know which documents are in scope until they begin their conversation with EMA about their upcoming submission. Obviously, there's a core set of documents, those submitted, that will definitely be in scope for which the sponsors can go ahead forward with the anonymization prior to the initiation of the process with the EMA. However, for those questionable documents, the sponsor is left to either prepare in advance, protecting the timeline, but potentially expending funds unnecessarily, or wait until the EMA process commences, at which time the timelines will be compressed. Either way, it's not an ideal outcome. The third major change to the guidance is a narrowing of the definition of listings eligible for removal. The new definition states that only per patient, per visit listings in which all patients for the entire trial are included are eligible for removal. All other listings must be redacted and not removed. The justification table is the document that EMA provides for sponsors to outline all requested company confidential information requested for redaction. Company confidential information is any information that would cause financial harm to the company should it be made public. There are columns for the company to outline what information is being requested for redaction and columns for the EMA to accept, reject, or request clarification of each CCI redaction requested. As previously shared, this document is not made public at the time of final publication. The justification table has created complications for sponsors for several reasons. The first complication is that the EMA requires a unique rationale for each proposed CCI redaction. EMA has stated that they will not accept canned answers across the CCI request. The second complication that we see as actually being more significant, a more significant issue over time, is that the EMA requires that any information proposed as a CCI redaction cannot already be found in the public domain. To date, we have not received feedback that EMA has done CCI research to actually validate whether CCI being requested for removal is in the public domain or not. However, under Policy 43, we have seen the EMA conduct this research. In one instance, one of our sponsors wanted to redact an investigator's name. In the EMA's research, they found that individual's name on a conference poster for that particular trial that was posted to the internet. The EMA rejected this redaction request. Over time, if the EMA catches up and puts in place more resources to handle this regulation, they may actually take more time to validate CCI redactions. Additionally, a statement at the top of the justification table, the statement here in red, it mandates that by turning in the justification table, you are confirming that the CCI you are requesting for redaction is not actually in the public domain. Another complication with the justification table is also how many individuals will be involved in the review process and how to incorporate them efficiently. Sponsors have chosen to have their intellectual property departments / legal departments, clinical, medical writing involved in CCI identification. Meeting tight timelines with multiple stakeholders complicates this process. In a press conference made by the EMA in October of 2016, it was stated that out of the 260,000 plus pages published within the first two Policy 70 submissions, only 2 pages worth of CCI redactions were accepted. The last justification table complication has to do with just simple logistics. The most utilized software package for redacting documents is Adobe. In order to create redactions in Adobe, you must have the Adobe Pro version and not the Adobe Reader that's free to everyone. Adobe Pro is not typically a standard software package across an organization. And given that multiple stakeholders across the organization may be involved in CCI review and that the stakeholders may change with each submission, organizations don't typically want to invest broadly in purchasing Adobe Pro and teaching all potential stakeholders how to use redaction capabilities. For this last issue, we've created a solution in our system. Sponsors can have the various stakeholders review for CCI, and then they highlight the CCI with a specified color. Once run through our system, the system then converts the highlights to redactions. Additionally, sponsors can add the justification and other required text in the comment that's associated with the highlight for the proposed CCI redaction. And then once it's run through our system, again, it converts that text, it pulls it out and puts it into, it populates a draft justification table version that's in Word. And here's just an example. Prior to Policy 70 going live, and each time we work with a sponsor new to the Policy 70 requirement, sponsors have tended to believe that managing company confidential information will be their most difficult task for Policy 70. But what we have found with management is that once we dive into the process, the personal protected data is actually more difficult. As I've shared in prior webinars, it's the difference between managing your own secrets, your company secrets, which is that CCI, or guessing what might be considered sensitive secrets to others, your patients and your study administrators. The two groups of the individuals that we typically find represented in regulatory documents are those two main buckets, patients and study administrators. The patient bucket can include family members of patients, for instance, children, babies, infants, and spouses. The anonymization report is different than the justification table. While the justification table is meant to list each item of information requested for redaction, the anonymization report is to provide an overall philosophy towards the anonymization of the submission package. Additionally, it's the document through which the sponsor indicates the efforts they've made to maintain data utility, a key priority for the EMA. The EMA has stated in stakeholder meetings that they really only intend to validate that the philosophies indicated in the anonymization report accurately represent the proposed redactions. However, it has been our experience that EMA has tended to take a fairly comprehensive view to select documents within each submission. The options to anonymize documents include masking, otherwise known as redaction. It's the act of removing personal data and replacing it typically with black boxes, or in the case of the EMA requirement, replacing it with blue boxes. The other two categories of techniques include data randomization, such as noise addition, in which numbers like height might be randomly adjusted up and down within a range. The other category of techniques are called generalization techniques, such as aggregation, in which an age of 27 might be changed to 20 to 30. All of these options have different impacts on the risk of re-identification and data utility. The current preferred solution for most sponsors is masking or redaction. To date, 6 of the 8 published submission packets under Policy 70 have utilized redaction. The other 2 had little to no redactions for study administrators, and the sponsors found that the documents did not actually contain patient PPD. EMA acknowledges in the guidance document that redaction is going to be the preferred technique for industry as we begin implementing Policy 70. The guidance document states EMA understands that in an initial phase, redaction techniques are likely to be used by applicants' MAHs. The reason that masking is appealing in the short term is that first, as stated by the EMA, we are dealing with retrospective redaction. Many of the trials and submissions currently being prepared for Policy 70 and some of the clinical study reports written for those trials were prepared before Policy 70 was even published. So patients were not informed during the consent process that their information was going to be made public, nor were the documents written with broad publication in mind. Some of the other techniques would require an entirely new document to be created in order to actually modify the content of the document. That poses efficiency and cost issues. And lastly, when creating another document, the format must go back to a Word format rather than a PDF. This creates quality control implications once the document is reopened for modification. So what's involved in the anonymization of submission documents and the removal of company confidential information? First, let's understand anonymization. Submission documents contain personal data. The EMA defines personal data as any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, a data subject. Recital 26 of the EU General Data Protection Regulation, which drives privacy broadly in the EU, states that to anonymize any data, the data must be stripped of sufficient elements such that the data subject can no longer be identified by all likely and reasonable means. To properly anonymize the submission document, sponsors have a few options. The first option is to ensure that re-identification cannot occur using linkability, singling out, and inference. Completely preventing linkability, singling out, and inference is extremely difficult and significantly impacts data utility. So the EMA has provided another option to assess anonymization, in which sponsors can conduct a risk assessment of their anonymization methods. To date, no sponsor has utilized the technique of fully preventing against linkability, singling out, and inference. Truthfully, we do not believe that EMA wants any sponsors to utilize this technique because of how it does severely impact data utility. So like the justification table, the anonymization report has its own complexities. Sponsors must choose between two risk assessment methods, the risk of re-identification for each submission. They can choose the qualitative method or the quantitative method. Sponsors must then determine what risk threshold they will aim to achieve, and corresponding with this decision, they must take into account different attacker scenarios in which one they believe is most appropriate. Sponsors must then assess the risk of re-identification against that predetermined threshold. Then they must speak to how data utility was maintained. And lastly, sponsors must make global redaction decisions as well as decisions specific to each submission, and even more at a granular level, decisions specific to each trial. Within our sponsor base, we are seeing a wide range of risk assessment approaches. Some sponsors consider all information associated with an individual to pose a high risk of re-identification, while others place a much lower risk with various categories of information associated with individuals. As you can see within this table, we have some sponsors who are willing to share age demographic information, who are only willing to share age demographic information for patients below 89, and no other demographic information. And we have other sponsors who are willing to share almost all demographic information. It remains to be seen what the real rather than the theoretical risk actually is. To date, and to our knowledge, there haven't been any calculated attacks committed on health information used to broaden our knowledge of the risk of re-identification. There have not actually been any clinical trials in which a specific patient or study administrator faced a negative impact as a result of their personal information being shared, their identity discovered, and then resulting in a lawsuit. But the extent to which sponsors feel that this is a real possibility drives the sponsors' philosophies towards redaction or retention of information surrounding individuals within the report. Not only are the rules of redaction varying across sponsors, most sponsors have found that even within a given submission, one approach to redaction is not sufficient. With the anonymization technique of masking or redaction, sponsors must determine the rules that will govern their redaction policy. Then they must consistently apply these rules across the documents and explain the rules in the anonymization report. In the pre-policy 78 days, one rule set was sufficient. It was typically a fairly conservative rule set that could be applied across all trial types. But in the post-policy 70 era, that's no longer the case. Rule sets are needed for different trial types. The characteristics that have driven different rule sets we have created for sponsors include this list. So disease prevalence, are you working with a rare disease? Population size, are we talking about phase 1, smaller trials, less than 50 patients? Number of study sites, what if it's a trial with 1 to 2 study sites? Number of patients per site, what if at any given site you've got 10 or less patients? And then sites per country, if you only have 1 site per country and you're trying to retain the country information. Take this SNP, for example, pulled from clinicaltrials.gov. This trial includes only females who are all white. Gender, when shown with other PPD, is a piece of demographic information that many privacy researchers have proven is one of the identifiers that increases the risk of re-identification. So in the case of a special population study, like a small population or rare disease, a sponsor would ideally like to redact gender. If clinicaltrials.gov reflects the inclusion criteria as being female, that information is already public. So should a sponsor actually redact it for that particular trial? Likewise, ethnicity is another identifier that has been shown to increase the risk of re-identification. In this case, clinicaltrial.gov reveals the ethnicity. Should a sponsor again attempt to redact in the Policy 70 document ethnicity if the information is already in the public domain? Should sponsors actually begin to make earlier efforts to keep this information out of the public domain? And will they be able to do that successfully? This is another snip of a clinicaltrials.gov posting for a trial, and as you can see from the first red box, this is a small population study. For small population studies, patient location is at higher risk of allowing patient re-identification. So most sponsors would like to remove all instances of a location with regards to patients for small population studies. The challenge is that for small trials, investigator location actually becomes a proxy for patient location. So ideally, a sponsor would like to redact investigator site location in a Policy 70 submission for a trial of this size. But in this instance, the investigator locations have already been made public from clinicaltrials.gov. So we ask same questions we asked on the prior example. What should you do and how should you handle investigator location information in your Policy 70 document when you've already made that information public? This is the EMA Policy 70 submission timeline outlined in the guidance document. The key timeframes are that sponsors will have to provide the redacted proposal version within a window of 30 days prior or 10 days following the EMA decision. Another key timeframe is that sponsors will have to have 20 days at the conclusion of the consultation phase to update and resubmit their packages. For the most part, the EMA is not currently meeting these timelines. They are working forward from those submissions with the earliest decision dates. From what we understand, they have around 100 submissions in the queue. EMA is initiating the process with a letter stating that the upcoming submission packet will be due within 30 days of receipt of the letter. Sponsors have had success that we've worked with in negotiating this timeline. However, we've heard from sponsors that the EMA is starting to pull back on allowances for delays. The sponsor delivers the redacted proposal version to the EMA. The EMA then works with the sponsor through the consultation phase. At the conclusion of the consultation phase, the sponsor is requested to deliver the final redacted version back to the EMA within 20 days. And we've heard recently that the EMA is not allowing extensions to this 20-day turnaround time either. In general, the EMA letters we've noticed are starting to come faster to sponsors. The EMA has stated that it is working towards catching up within 2017. This could be challenging for those sponsors who have not yet gone through a consultation process. The sponsors who were first to go through this process may at the time have felt that being one of the first rounds was a significant disadvantage. However, the opportunity to be at the front of the queue has enabled those sponsors to go up the learning curve with the EMA and with the allowance of a more protracted timeline to respond to the requirement. But now that EMA is moving faster, they may be less apt to give time allowances to those sponsors going through the process for the first time. Who approves these rules for each sponsor? The answer is that it really varies, but what typically doesn't vary is that there almost always is a group of stakeholders involved in the transparency and disclosure decisions, particularly around Policy 70 because of the broad publications of the document. The stakeholders typically include representatives from those listed on this slide. Ultimately, we believe that the steps in the process are growing, the number of steps in this process as a result of Policy 70, and that there's more collaboration involved. Obviously, there's an abundance of steps, and some of the detail has been left off for this slide, but I think what's most important about this slide and this process are the steps that actually do require collaboration. Out of the 25 steps represented in this slide, 13 require collaboration of some kind. These collaborative steps are represented by the red boxes. We believe the entire process is connected. Initial protocol development or later CSR development often impact not only downstream redaction efforts, but also plain language summary or non-technical summary creation, and registry protocol and postings. Some sponsors are just starting the process of creating centralized transparency and disclosure teams, while others have their T&D team in place, but are working to get the T&D team and knowledge incorporated into more upstream activities. Here is an example list of different requirements of regulatory information being placed in the public domain for which the sponsor has some form of input. Maybe not the final say, as in the European Public Assessment Report, or EPAR, produced by the EMA to explain their decision for a particular submission. But for each of these documents listed here, sponsors have input or some level of control of how the documents are prepared for the public domain. What is a newer trend in the market are all the sources not controlled by the sponsor. Here is a list of various organizations working to make regulatory information public, either through public press campaigns, aggregation of the regulatory information, and in some cases, assessment of individual organizations' compliance with regulatory and ethical transparency requirements. Some of these assessments are done with sponsor input, while others are seemingly adversarial and do not provide sponsors with an opportunity to explain or become compliant. For instance, the COMPARE project assesses public outcome reporting. The organization reviews protocol registration information provided in public registries and then compares those intended outcome measures with the results reporting done in those same registries and in medical journals. The COMPARE project does not give sponsors an opportunity to speak to the findings, but rather the COMPARE project researchers send letters to the medical journals with explanations of the inconsistencies that they found. As a different example, the Good Pharma Scorecard is an assessment of compliance to both regulatory and ethical standards of trial registration, protocols and results, and through publications. This assessment is conducted by Bioethics International and does include an opportunity for sponsors to review their results in advance of the results being published. And it gives sponsors an opportunity to provide feedback to the organization, to Bioethics International, on the findings. What are the risks with not being compliant? Under new regulations, fines are a greater possibility. The EU also has its non-compliance list that they intend to maintain publicly. This list will state all sponsors found to be non-compliant with the Policy 70 requirement. We had not heard the EU really threaten usage of this action until just recently. We've received feedback from some sponsors that they are being told if they cannot meet Policy 70 deadlines, they would be placed on the non-compliance list. Another risk is negative results from the external assessments like COMPARE and Good Pharma Scorecard. Another issue is any regulatory non-compliance can be met with increased scrutiny from regulatory agencies. And with all of these, the risk that there is a possibility of negative brand implications for the organization. Lastly, if the preparation of documents aren't handled properly, there is the concern of potential lawsuits from patients and/or study administrators. Through our compliance offering, we deliver a more holistic approach to transparency and disclosure. There are basically two approaches to a holistic compliance implementation, retrospective and prospective. And while we continue to be in a retrospective phase of Policy 70 execution, both of these approaches are required. For retrospective compliance, we offer an approach in which our transparency and disclosure specialists conduct a review of publicly disclosed information for a given program. An audit-style risk assessment is then conducted on those sources, evaluating the consistency of the information across the different sources and the program's overall compliance with regulatory and ethical requirements. The prospective partnership pairs medical writers with transparency and disclosure expertise and/or transparency disclosure specialists within a given program. Those individuals provide T&D perspectives throughout the life cycle of the program, from protocol development to final fulfillment of the T&D regulatory requirements. The steps to conduct the audit for the retrospective approach include confirmation of the public source list with the sponsor. As outlined in discussion of the prior slide, an audit-style assessment is conducted, evaluating the consistency of the information and compliance with regulatory and ethical standards. It's important to note that many of our sponsors align themselves, of course, with regulatory standards and not necessarily the non-obligatory ethical standards. But the intent of the assessment is really to allow sponsors to know where they fall in the spectrum so that they can make conscious decisions as to what and how they want to be compliant. This assessment could result in major or minor findings. The findings will be investigated in a thorough review. Our organization will propose corrective actions that the sponsor can decide whether or not to implement, And if the sponsor chooses, we can assist in the implementation of the selected solution. Another way in which we are working to develop a more holistic approach to transparency and disclosure is the development of a web portal database to house plain language summaries. Plain language summaries, or non-technical summaries, tend to have two purposes. Some sponsors use them as a document to be included with a formal thank you that is delivered hard copy back to the patients to thank them for their participation in a trial. Other sponsors are using these summaries to provide a summary to the broader public that is more accessible than the technical language used in regulatory documents. Through our partnership with Syscript, a nonprofit trial information source for patients in the public, we provide a service that supports sponsors in the development of these summaries. We firmly believe that the best way to thank patients is still to deliver that hard copy summary back to the patients, but we acknowledge that in this modern age of technology, making these summaries accessible on the internet is only to the advantage of patients and to the public, offering yet another vehicle through which they can get trial information. This is just a mock-up of the web portal, and we aim to roll out the portal at the beginning of Q2. And while you have already seen this slide, I'm representing it as the concluding and main point. Transparency and disclosure of clinical trials is a rapidly evolving space. The faster sponsors and supporting vendors are able to connect the requirement dots, the more efficient sponsors will become in meeting the ethical and regulatory requirements that this space demands. And now I believe we have some time for questions.
Thanks, Laura. We invite our audience to submit their questions into the Q&A box for Laura. Looks like our first question from the audience is, have you received any feedback from your sponsors going through consultation as to how much the EMA is pushing back on the sponsor's approach to redaction?
Yes, actually, and it's not always consistent. We have heard from some sponsors that they are getting significant pushback. The EMA is placing a lot of comments into their anonymization reports and really digging into great detail in, as I mentioned, a select few of their CSRs that they've provided. But we've heard from other sponsors that the EMA is starting to express more of a acknowledgement that the sponsors are the data controllers and that they ultimately should have a say. And I will say what to date has been consistent across our sponsor base is that even when sponsors get into that consultation phase and have a discussion with the EMA, there may be some areas where the sponsor does not ultimately align with the EMA on their final decision, meaning that the sponsor may keep some approach to specific redaction rules. They may keep their approach even though the EMA has requested that they change it. And to date, as far as our understanding goes, none of those sponsors have been threatened with a non-compliance list. So I think there is some allowance for sponsors to have independent decision-making, but the EMA does seem to be weighing in on, I would say, the majority of the sponsors we work with.
We now have another question. Can you provide more context around CCI? Module 2 has very little information that can truly be considered CCI. What experiences have you encountered that you can share?
Yeah, so I gave the example during the presentation of what the EMA stated for their press conference when they rolled out the first two. And it was ultimately that out of the 260,000 plus pages of documents that were reviewed for those two submissions, very little CCI was accepted. And we, even working with our sponsors, I mean, we have some sponsors who requested 100 different elements of CCI when they first submitted their package, and ultimately may have ended up with 7 being accepted. So our overall experience is that the EMA is really, it's very difficult to get CCI approved through the EMA. And I'll also share that we have some sponsors who have been through the process more than once. And in that first round, their teams, their stakeholders spend a lot of time looking for CCI, outlining the CCI, justifying the CCI, only to have it whittled significantly down, and then the ultimate result in their later rounds working through a consultation process is that their teams are not spending that kind of time looking for CCI. They acknowledge that they're not going to be able to get it through, they're not going to be able to get it approved. So the sponsors so far do seem to be sort of modifying their processes as they go through a consultation process more than once.
Someone asks, the current process is for sponsors to submit redacted documents through the gateway, and they're published on the EMA website. Can you confirm if in the future the gateway will feed directly into the new EU portal and database?
So I don't know that that clarification has actually been made. Based on some of the conferences that I've attended recently and hearing the EU deliver feedback, the clinical trial regulation is a separate regulation. So, you know, what gets posted to the trial registry under the clinical trial regulation is not necessarily going to be the same as EMA Policy 70. And right now, the time frames don't even, they're not consistent. So I don't think there's clarity around that. I think certainly, at least in the presentation that I participated in, there was a lot of requesting that was going to the EMA to ask that this process be streamlined and that it become ultimately one requirement. But the only answer that we received from the EMA, well, this was the trial registry representative. The only answer was that it hasn't been resolved yet.
Someone would like to know, has the EMA started pushing for any other anonymization techniques other than redaction?
From the feedback that we have received, the EMA has not actually started pushing for other techniques. We get the sense that the EMA is still, they are still working up a learning curve, even in spite of the fact that they are starting to increase the speed through which they work through the submissions, but I'm not sure that they're ready yet to start pushing toward other techniques. And we have not heard of them doing so in any of the communication with our sponsors.
Looks like we have one final question. What is the biggest challenge for sponsors' ability to comply with EMA Policy 70 that you've seen so far?
So right now, I think the biggest challenge is definitely that second component, that second change to the guidance document that I mentioned in the presentation. The fact that the EMA has really broadened the scope of what CSRs are in scope versus out of scope, and they've left it as a question mark. And I think it's really challenging for sponsors to try. I think most sponsors are trying to be prepared and trying to go into their initial Policy 70 discussions with those documents ready to go. But when you don't know which documents are going to be in scope and you're provided with a finite timeline in which to turn all of those documents around, I think that's really creating a challenge for sponsors. And not just on the front end. We had sponsors who were already in the consultation process when this guidance was published, and so they had their initial round completed to go into they had their redacted proposal version completed, went into consultation, and came out of consultation with the requirement for additional documents to be redacted on top of the rule changes that they had negotiated with EMA. So now not only are they left with modifying the existing documents that they had already prepared, but they actually had to prepare an additional set of documents to include in the Policy 70 submission. So I think the combination of timeline with this question around scope has created the biggest challenge.
We've got one more question. Thus far, it seems as though only the actual clinical trial regulation has been published thus far. When does the EMA intend publishing the guidance on this?
I think I believe with the clinical trial regulation, there is some guidance, but it doesn't really go into detail about the redacted documents, the CSRs that are being prepared to be placed on the portal. But I'm not sure that they've actually concluded how they want to go about this. Like I shared before, I think they are still figuring out how the clinical trial regulation CSR requirement is going to work in conjunction with EMA Policy 70. So I don't know when they will publish a guidance that gets to the detail of the redactions, but there is some guidance. It's just not pertaining to redacted, the redacted CSRs.